I'm Danny Brown, and you're listening to 1 Minute Podcast Tips, the show that helps you be a better podcaster in just a minute a week. If you want more specific tips just for you and your podcast, check out the Magic Mike membership at 1minutepodcasttips.com/support. And now, this week's episode. With the news that Google Podcasts is closing next year, what should you be doing for these listeners that use the Google Podcast app to make sure you don't lose them? Thankfully, there are a few options. Now, the first one is to move them over to YouTube Music, which is one of the goals of Google when it comes to podcasts. However, not everybody has YouTube Music installed on their phone, and they might not want to install it. In that case, you want to take a different approach. The first one is to have a podcast website. Now, I've spoken before in an earlier episode about the benefits of having a podcast website, and I'll link to that episode in the show notes, so be sure to check them out. But the beauty of having a podcast website is that it doesn't matter what podcast app disappears, you will always have somewhere to direct your listeners. Most podcast hosts offer a free website with their hosting plan, so check out your host for that. If not, it's easy to set up a free website using WordPress, Wix, or other tools like that. Alternatively, another option is to try and move them to another podcast app. This is where your podcast analytics come into play, because you can look at them and see which apps are the most popular for your listeners. And then from maybe the top 3 or 4, you can recommend your current Google Podcast listeners to move to that app. Now keep in mind, most Google Podcast app listeners will probably be on Android phones, so make sure you recommend an app that works on Android. For example, it's no good saying listen on Apple Podcasts if I'm an Android user. So apps like Spotify, Pocket Casts, Good Pods and more are all good options to direct them to. The main thing is to start encouraging listeners now to make the move. That way, when Google Podcast does close down, it won't come as a surprise and your listeners will still be with your show. Until the next time, happy podcasting. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy 1 Minute Podcast Tips, be sure to share with your friends and other podcasters so they can enjoy it too. Until the next time, happy podcasting.